Have you ever looked at the life you've built and quietly wondered where you went inside it? Graham Whitmore was once the man with everything: wealth, power, a view from the top. But at a glittering gala, one glance across the room shattered the illusion of the woman who once believed in him had returned, not as the wife he lost, but as the woman he never truly saw. Lily Carter didn't come back with anger. She came back with purpose, with grace, and with a truth he could no longer outrun. What happens when the man who controlled everything is forced to reckon with the one thing he abandoned himself? If you were Graham, would you cling to the legacy that made you rich, or walk into the fire of who you used to be, just to find your way back? This isn't just a story about second chances. It's about remembering the version of yourself you silenced to survive. And for anyone who's ever wondered, is it too late to begin again? This story says no. If this speaks to a part of your heart you thought was forgotten, share and subscribe, because now it's time to begin. The winter wind cut through Fifth Avenue like a blade, but inside the Waldorf Grand, the air was warm, polished, and humming with old money. 1,000 chandeliers spilled light across velvet walls, men in tailored tuxedos, women wrapped in silk and stories. Waiters moved like whispers, and standing near the marble entrance, with a glass of neat bourbon in hand, was Graham Whitmore, the man who, by most accounts, already had it all. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it was calculated. The kind of smile that said, "I've already read the ending, you're just catching up." Tonight was no different. The annual Green Futures Gala wasn't just another red carpet event, it was a stage, a place where the powerful gathered not just to be seen, but to outshine. And Graham, he planned to announce Whitmore Energy's groundbreaking leap into autonomous solar infrastructure, a move that would crush competitors and crown him once again as the pioneer of progress. Beside him stood Natalie Evans, his date, 31, impeccably dressed, brilliant in the way sharp things are. Her smile was all surface, but her eyes were trained, constantly scanning, calculating who to charm and who to destroy. She clung to Graham's arm, not with affection, but with entitlement. The two made a striking pair, she, radiant and assertive, he, restrained and monumental. "You look restless," Natalie said, brushing imaginary lint from his jacket sleeve. "I don't do waiting," Graham replied, eyes on the crowd. The orchestra swelled in the background. Across the ballroom, champagne clinked, deals were hinted at, old rivals exchanged thin smiles. Then, it happened. The doors parted, as if the room itself took a breath, and through that breath stepped a woman in a midnight blue gown, her posture poised, her stride effortless. Lily Carter. Graham's glass stopped midair. He hadn't seen her in 4 years, not since the morning she left their Vermont cabin with nothing but her name, her pride, and the sound of her boots on frosted gravel. She hadn't cried. She hadn't pleaded. She had only said, "I need to matter to myself again." And now, she was here. She wasn't just in the room, she took the room. Every conversation in her path softened. Heads turned. The hush wasn't dramatic. It was instinctual. Lily had changed. The kindness in her face was still there, but it had grown roots depth that only silence and survival can shape. She wore no diamonds, no signature designer clutch, and yet she glowed, not like Natalie's curated shimmer. Lily glowed like a campfire in a dark forest, steady, warm, undeniable. Graham's jaw tensed. His bourbon felt suddenly sharp. "Who's that?" Natalie asked, sensing the shift. Graham didn't answer, because how could he explain her? The woman who once stood behind him at board meetings, whose ideas were too often attributed to him, whose laughter used to fill the Vermont mornings, now stood yards away, independent, unreadable. And then she looked at him, just once, a glance. No smile, no hatred, just a look that landed and left, as if to say, "I remember everything, but I've moved on." That single moment cracked something in Graham that hadn't moved in years. Natalie leaned in. "You know her." Still no answer. Across the room. Lily was greeted by a senator, a few philanthropists, and most notably, Russell Dane, CEO of Meridian Renewables, Whitmore Energy's largest rival. Natalie's voice dropped. What's she doing with him, I don't know, Graham said, though the words felt too small for the storm inside him. Because deep down, he did know. Lily had never been after revenge. She had always wanted impact, change, something real. And Graham, in all his acquisitions, had somehow forgotten that not everything could be owned. As the gala continued around him, Graham no longer saw the press or the politics, only the woman who once walked away from his empire and had now returned stronger than anyone expected. And something in him whispered, you didn't lose her because she stopped loving you. You lost her because you stopped seeing her. Graham Whitmore stood still, watching as Lily Carter disappeared into the warm blur of gala light and conversation. Her midnight blue gown shimmered like ocean waves beneath crystal chandeliers. But it wasn't the dress. It was her unshaken, unapologetic, and untouchable in a way that only someone who had walked through fire could be. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The people around her leaned in, not because she demanded it, but because her presence drew them. Her calm wasn't rehearsed. It was lived in, worn like a favorite sweater you don't need to show off. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed to raise her voice. The world leaned closer, just to hear her speak, and Graham, once her world, was now simply watching from across the room. Natalie noticed his silence, and it didn't take long for her curiosity to twist into suspicion. Are you seriously not going to tell me who she is? She asked. Graham didn't move his gaze. She's my ex-wife. Natalie blinked. That woman is your ex-wife. He nodded, his voice barely a breath. Natalie laughed, short and sharp. Well, I can see why you kept that little fact buried. She walks like she owns the air. Graham didn't respond. He was too busy trying to breathe through it, because the truth wasn't that Lily looked different. It was that he did. Lily had once waited for him in the silence of their Vermont cabin, curled beside a crackling fire with dreams in her chest and sadness behind her smile. She had believed in him more than he ever believed in himself. And he, foolish and blinded by ambition, had treated her belief like it was something owed. He remembered one night vividly. She had sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, stars above them, and whispered, "Do you think love is only real when it's loud?" He had said nothing. Now, years later, the answer haunted him. No, it's real when it's seen. And he hadn't seen her. Not really. Not until tonight. Across the ballroom. Lily laughed at something Russell Dane had said. Russell, tall, silver-haired, and every bit the media darling leaned in with ease. It wasn't flirtation. It was partnership, strategy, respect. And Graham felt it like a bruise. She had aligned herself with the enemy. But to Lily, there were no enemies. Only people doing the right thing or failing to. Graham watched her hand gesture gently as she spoke about a project he vaguely recognized, something with solar integration in low-income rural areas. It was the same proposal she had brought to his board years ago, the one he had shelved. Too costly, too risky, too idealistic. And now it was real. It had momentum, and it wasn't his. Natalie followed his line of sight, unimpressed. So, what's she, some charity, darling? Now Graham shot her a glance. She's the founder of ArcLight. Natalie blinked. The ArcLight. As in the initiative getting federal recognition next month. He nodded once. Natalie's expression tightened. She crossed her arms, lips pursed. Charming. So, the ex has found her soapbox. You going to congratulate her, or just brood like some tragic Hemingway anti-hero? He didn't answer, because right then, Lily turned. Their eyes met again briefly, and something passed between them. Not nostalgia, not pain, but recognition. Graham stepped away from Natalie without a word, his drink forgotten on a tray. His steps were slow but steady, threading through the glittering crowd like a man walking into a memory. Lily noticed. She didn't move. When he reached her, the space between them felt full of everything unsaid. Lily, he said softly. She didn't smile. Graham. Her voice hadn't changed. Still low, still warm, still capable of cutting him open with its clarity. You look... He trailed off. Because what could he say? Beautiful, strong, like the version of yourself I never deserved. Different, she offered. No, he said, more like yourself than ever. That earned him the ghost of a smile. Russell cleared his throat politely. I'll give you two a moment. Lily nodded, her gaze still on Graham. The noise of the ballroom faded. All Graham could hear was the soft clink of glasses, the echo of his own pulse, and the weight of 100 things he had never said. I didn't know you'd be here, he said. I didn't come for you, she replied. I came for Arclight. I know. She studied him, not unkindly, just fully, like someone taking in the damage and deciding what still stood. You look tired, she said. I am... A pause. And you? He asked. Are you happy? Lily tilted her head slightly, as if that question deserved a sacred answer. Then she said, I'm free. That's close enough. Graham felt the earth shift. Because Lily Carter hadn't just walked back into the ballroom of his life, she had walked back in as someone he no longer had power over. And yet, her presence still held power over him. The conversation was brief, measured, civil. But when she walked away, the silence she left behind roared louder than any argument they'd ever had. Graham stood in it, raw and rattled. For the first time in years, he realized what real strength looked like. It wasn't control. It wasn't dominance. It was the ability to leave and come back whole. And Lily. She was whole now. He, on the other hand, was just beginning to understand how broken he really was. The night moved on without waiting for Graham Whitmore to catch up. The orchestra picked up a jazzy rendition of Autumn Leaves, and champagne poured like gold across clinking flutes. Cameras flashed, laughter drifted, speeches resumed. But Graham couldn't hear any of it. He stood near a table of hors d'oeuvres he had no intention of touching, staring toward the stage where Lily Carter now stood under soft amber lights. Her posture composed, hands folded loosely before her. She was being introduced by the event chair. Something about her work with Arclight, the clean energy nonprofit that had recently partnered with Meridian Renewables on a pilot program in Mississippi. Words like transformative, equitable, bold floated across the ballroom. But Graham already knew what mattered. Lily hadn't just built something new. She had built it without him. And maybe, in some ways, because of him. As she stepped up to the podium, the applause came easily. No charity claps. No obligatory acknowledgments. This was earned. Lily looked out over the room, calm, certain, not searching for anyone, not even him. And then she spoke. When I started Arclight, she said, her voice smooth but resonant. I didn't have a plan big enough for the work ahead. I just had one question that wouldn't leave me alone. She paused. The room leaned in. What if the people who are hardest to reach are exactly the ones worth reaching? A murmur of agreement rippled softly through the space. I've spent the last 3 years working with communities forgotten by the energy revolution. The places with bad roads, aging power lines, and no lobbyists. And in those towns, I've seen something that Silicon Valley often forgets. Innovation isn't real until it serves someone who can't afford to ask for it. That line hit Graham square in the chest. He could feel Natalie shift uncomfortably a few feet away. He wasn't sure if she understood the message, but he did. Because Lily's words weren't just philosophy, they were a mirror. And in that reflection, he saw the version of himself he had worked hard to bury idealistic, daring, and deeply afraid of not being taken seriously if he led with heart instead of headlines. Graham remembered when Lily first pitched her community-based solar plan to the Whitmore Energy Board. He had watched her speak with that same clarity, that same conviction. But back then, he had shut it down. Too idealistic, he'd said, too slow on ROI, too emotional. But it hadn't been emotion, it had been vision. And now, here she was, standing in front of a crowd of donors and dignitaries, not pleading for belief, but inviting them to join something already moving, already alive. She closed her short speech with a quiet line. We don't build a better world by waiting for perfect conditions. We build it by showing up where it hurts most and staying. The audience rose in unison. The standing ovation was immediate and unforced. Graham didn't stand, not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't. His legs felt like stone, his chest like it held something heavier than lungs, something closer to grief. Not for Lily, for the man he had once been. After she stepped off stage, Lily was surrounded reporters, philanthropists, a senator or two. Graham watched her handle it all with practiced grace, smiling when needed, but never pandering, always grounded. Natalie appeared at his side. Well, she said with tight sarcasm, that was wholesome. He didn't answer. I'm guessing we can't afford to ignore her anymore, she added. Still, no response. Natalie turned to face him. Graham, are you listening? He blinked slowly, then finally spoke. Do you remember the Carter Initiative? She frowned. That dusty proposal in the archives. Barely. She brought it to me 4 years ago. I didn't just ignore it. I buried it. Why? Because I didn't want her to be right. Natalie scoffed. You think she's right now? You think all this do-gooder stuff actually moves the market? Graham looked at her, his voice quieter than usual. Maybe it moves something more important. Natalie stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. She turned away, annoyed, and melted back into the crowd. Graham didn't follow. Instead, he walked slowly toward the far side of the room, needing space, needing silence. As he passed a floor-to-ceiling window, he stopped. Outside, snow had started to fall. It gathered gently on the ledges, dancing in the city wind. The lights of Manhattan flickered below like embers in a restless fire, and in the reflection on the glass, he caught his own face. But it wasn't the man who smiled on Forbes covers. It was the man Lily had once held in the dark after his father died, the man she had believed in before the world taught him how to hide. Graham closed his eyes. Somewhere behind him, laughter echoed and deals were born. But he didn't care. All he could think was, her smile didn't just shake the room, it shook the foundation of the man I became. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to tear it down. Graham Whitmore had never felt small in a room before. He was a man used to commanding attention, his presence, his net worth, his voice. In the world of clean energy, titans and tech-forward tycoons, Graham had always been a man with gravity. But that night, as he stood just beyond the velvet drapes of the ballroom, watching the echo of Lily Carter's speech ripple through the crowd, he felt peripheral. People weren't talking about him. They were talking about her. He could hear snippets of admiration as they passed by phrases like humble power, visionary. You can tell she means it. A younger executive in a Navy tux whispered to his date, "She's the future of this industry." And the date replied, "No, she's what it should have been all along." The words stung more than Graham cared to admit. He sipped from the same bourbon he hadn't finished earlier. The ice had melted, but the burn was still there. Across the ballroom, Lily stood near the sponsor wall, surrounded again not by people trying to impress her, but by people trying to understand how to join her cause. She answered questions with patience, never rushed, never posturing. She wasn't selling an image. She was living a mission. And the irony, Graham had once tried to shape her into something more palatable, less idealistic, more strategic. She had refused. He'd called it stubborn. Now, he saw it for what it truly was, integrity. He hadn't realized Natalie had returned to his side until her voice cut through the fog of thought. She's working the room like a seasoned politician. He didn't look at her. She's not working it. She's walking through it. Natalie raised a brow. That's a distinction only a man still in love would make. Her tone was light, but something beneath it twisted. Graham finally met her gaze. Maybe I am. Natalie stiffened, her hand dropping from his arm. That wasn't a confession, he said evenly. It was a realization. Convenient timing, she muttered. Right after she becomes the darling of the room. Graham didn't answer. There was no point. Natalie narrowed her eyes. You do realize who she's partnered with. right, Russell Dane? He's not just your competitor. He's the man who's been angling to strip your market share for the last 3 quarters. I'm aware. Then what the hell are you doing standing here like some love-struck college boy? Graham sighed. Listening. To what? To everything I've ignored for too long. Natalie scoffed and stepped back. You're not the man I thought you were. No, he said. I'm finally realizing that, too. Later. Graham excused himself from the crowd and headed toward the private lounge on the 2nd floor, someplace quieter, less polished, a space reserved for board members and major donors. He needed air, thought, time. But as he opened the door, he stopped short. Lily was already inside. She was alone, standing by the window, hands resting on the sill, gazing out over the city as snow fell lightly against the glass. He considered leaving, thought about backing away quietly, but she spoke before he could. You still walk heavy, she said, without turning. He smiled faintly. I always meant to work on that. Lily turned slowly, her expression unreadable. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Graham asked, Do you regret it? She tilted her head. Leaving you? Yes. She didn't hesitate. No. But I regretted needing to. That answer landed softly but cut deep. I didn't see you, he said, more to himself than to her. Not really. You saw what you needed, she replied, and what didn't fit that. You edited out. I'm sorry, Lily, she nodded, her gaze kind but firm. I believe you, but forgiveness doesn't mean return. I'm not asking for that. Then what are you asking for? He paused. I just wanted to see you again, not the memory of you, not the version I kept in my head. You. Now. She looked at him a long moment, then exhaled. Well, here I am. It wasn't bitter, just final. Grown. Lily stepped away from the window, collected her clutch from the table, and walked past him. Then stopped, turned. You know, Graham, she said softly, the part that hurt most wasn't that you didn't believe in me. It was that you stopped believing in the things we used to dream about. And with that, she left the room. Graham sat in the silence she left behind. The words echoed. Not believing in her was one thing, but losing belief in what they once shared, that was the true abandonment. He thought about the mission they'd once scribbled down on napkins over midnight takeout. The idea that energy shouldn't just be efficient, but equitable. That wealth didn't matter if it didn't do something. That building something real meant including the people nobody talked about. And somewhere along the way, he had traded all that for stock prices and status. Now Lily stood in the center of every room he used to own, not by design, but by gravity. She had become what they once hoped he would. And Graham. He wasn't sure what he had become, but tonight, for the first time in a very long time, he knew what he wanted to be again. The cold outside was indifferent, but inside the Waldorf Grand, something fragile lingered in the air like dust caught in morning light. The afterglow of the gala had begun to dim. The last string notes of the quartet melted into soft jazz, and the waitstaff moved with practiced silence, clearing crystal flutes and empty plates. Graham Whitmore stood alone on the balcony, just outside the 2nd floor lounge, his breath visible in the winter air. The city below pulsed, as always, but he felt apart from it, removed, like a man watching his own life from behind glass. He'd always been good with words, press conferences, board meetings, investor calls, but tonight they failed him. Because some truths didn't need polish. They needed honesty. And honesty, Graham had learned, was not his natural state, not when it required vulnerability. He turned as the door behind him clicked open. Lily Carter stepped onto the balcony, wrapping a gray wool shawl around her shoulders. Her hair lifted slightly in the breeze, catching soft flecks of snow. She didn't startle, didn't ask if he needed space. She simply stood beside him, staring at the city as if the answers to every unspoken question might be written in the skyline. You always hated the cold, Graham said after a beat. I still do, she replied. Then why come out here to see if you'd speak when no one else was listening? He winced, not visibly, but inwardly, as if her words had pierced through layers of armor carefully built over decades. She was good at that. She always had been. I never meant for things to end the way they did. Graham began, the words heavy, but they did. Lily answered, not unkindly, and meaning doesn't undo damage. I thought I was building something for us. No, Graham. You were building something for you, and I was supposed to clap quietly in the background. That's not fair. It's not meant to be, she said, finally turning to look at him. It's meant to be true. There was no heat in her voice, only clarity, and that, somehow, hurt more. I was trying to protect us, he added, from risk, from exposure, from chaos. No, you were trying to protect your image of us, and in the process, you erased me. The words landed like stones dropped into deep water. Lily leaned on the railing, her fingers pink from the cold. Do you remember that night in Vermont, she asked, the one when the power went out during the snowstorm? Graham nodded slowly. You lit every candle in the house. Said darkness didn't scare you. It was the silence that did. She smiled faintly. And still, I stayed. I didn't ask you to. No, she said, her eyes sharp now. You didn't ask anything. You decided. You assumed. You expected. Graham swallowed hard. You were brilliant, Graham, she continued. Still are. But brilliance means nothing if it blinds you to the people standing in your light. That line so quiet, so true, it hollowed something in him. I was afraid, he admitted finally, of what of being seen as weak, of failing, of losing control. I thought if I could control the outcomes, I could protect us. But the truth is, I only protected myself. Lily didn't respond right away. Then, softly, thank you for saying that. The wind picked up slightly. Graham noticed her arms tightening around the shawl. He shrugged off his coat, gently draping it over her shoulders. She accepted it without thanks, without awkwardness. There was still that familiar rhythm between them, something no time or silence could fully erase. I think I still carry parts of you, Graham said, voice rough. Not the woman I wanted you to be, but the one you always were. And maybe that's what's kept me up at night. Lily turned to face him fully. I never hated you, Graham, she said. I hated who I became trying to stay with you. That truth cut deep, not in anger, but in sorrow. He had tried so hard to succeed, to win, to provide. But somewhere along the way, he'd made the most human of mistakes. He had confused love with loyalty, and loyalty with silence. I thought if I gave you everything, you'd feel seen, he said. I didn't need everything, she replied. I just needed you. Not your money, not your legacy, just the man who used to dream with me. Silence fell again, not heavy but reverent, like both of them were standing in the ruins of something sacred, unsure whether to rebuild or let it remain as memory. After a long moment, Lily stepped back. I'm not angry anymore, Graham. I haven't been for a long time. I know. But forgiveness, she added, doesn't mean we rewrite the past. It just means we stop letting it control the present. Graham nodded, understanding more in that moment than in years of self-justifying silence. As Lily turned to leave, she paused. You're a good man, Graham. But being good for the world doesn't mean much if you're not good to the people closest to you. Then she was gone. The door clicked softly behind her, and Graham was left with the city and the cold and the aching knowledge that sometimes truth doesn't come to punish, but to refine. Back inside, the ballroom had shifted into its final phase, wine nearly gone, heels in hand, voices fading into post-event murmur. But on the balcony, a man stood still, unmoving, but not unchanged. The morning after the gala, Graham Whitmore sat in his corner office on the 61st floor of Whitmore Tower, staring out at the gray Manhattan skyline. The city moved in its usual rhythm below sirens wailing faintly, taxis threading through traffic like golden needles, but none of it felt real. His office was pristine, the furniture modern, cold, intentional, the kind of place designed for clarity and power. But Graham felt neither. The words Lily had spoken on the balcony the night before echoed in his chest with relentless precision. Being good for the world doesn't mean much if you're not good to the people closest to you. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with anger, but with truth. That kind of gaze doesn't bruise. It cuts, deep and surgical. He had built an empire on precision, forecasts, metrics, control. But nothing about this felt measurable. Nothing about this could be undone with a press release or a board vote. It was personal. And now, unexpectedly so, was the betrayal that was coming. "Graham," came a voice from the doorway. Philip Grant, his chief operating officer and longtime colleague, stepped into the office with his usual air of professionalism. He wore his confidence like an expensive overcoat, measured, deliberate, with just enough warmth to appear human. Behind him, Natalie Evans followed. Graham looked up, his brow tightening. "I thought you were in Chicago this morning." "I changed my plans," Philip replied, sitting without asking. "There's something we need to discuss." Natalie closed the door behind her, but didn't sit. Her arms were folded, her face unreadable. Something in the air shifted, heavy, unsettling. Graham felt it immediately, like a wrong note in a familiar song. Philip opened his briefcase slowly, then placed a folder on the desk. Thick, too thick. "What's this?" Graham asked. "Contingency documentation," Philip replied, "in the event of executive leadership transition." Graham's eyes narrowed. Philip continued. "There's concern among board members that recent decisions, specifically your absence from key negotiations and the fallout from your declining favor with federal agencies, are signs of distraction." Natalie spoke up now, her voice cool. "They're not wrong." Graham's hands tightened around the edge of his chair. "You're staging a coup," he said quietly. Philip's face didn't flicker. "We're safeguarding the company." Natalie added, "You've let personal emotions bleed into corporate strategy. That speech last night. You didn't say a word. You let Lily's narrative own the evening, and by extension, the market's perception of you." Graham stood slowly. His voice was low, even. "You're using my name, my legacy, my infrastructure against me. It's not personal," Philip said. "That's the problem," Graham snapped. "It should be." He looked at Natalie now. Something behind his eyes both hurt and sharper than before. "You knew," he said. She didn't deny it. "I brought you into my life," he added. "Let you in past the gates I built for everyone else. And I used the key," she replied, "because you weren't paying attention." The honesty of it struck him harder than any lie. Graham picked up the folder, flipped it open, and scanned proposals for restructuring, reassigning decision rights, granting temporary voting power to the board's emergency council. It was airtight, efficient, exactly how he would have done it if he were on the other side. He closed the folder calmly and looked up. "You've spent months preparing this." "Yes," Philip said. Graham nodded. "And yet, it only takes me one phone call to end both your careers." Philip's smile thinned. "Only if you still have control, which, depending on the board's decision this afternoon, you might not." Natalie stepped forward. "Think about what you're risking by fighting this." "I have," Graham said, "and I'd rather burn it down than hand it over to two people who treat vision like a spreadsheet." A beat of silence. Then, Graham stepped around the desk. "Get out," he said. Philip rose. "We'll speak again after the vote." "No," Graham said. "You'll speak, but I won't be listening." They left. And when the door clicked shut behind them, Graham stood still, not with defeat, but something colder. Determination. 10 minutes later, he was dialing a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice. Then Lily Carter. He exhaled. "It's Graham." A pause. "I figured," she said. "No warmth, no edge, just presence. I need your help." She didn't laugh, didn't scoff. "Say that again," she asked. "I need your help." he repeated. Another pause. Then I'm listening. That afternoon, Graham called for an emergency board session. He walked in not with Natalie, not with Philip, but alone. Until 5 minutes in, when Lily walked through the double doors, calm as moonlight, holding a separate file of her own. It was Graham's move now, and for the first time in years, he wasn't making it from above the room, but from inside it. Not to control, not to crush, but to reclaim what he had forgotten. You can only lead what you're willing to fight for, even when it breaks you. The boardroom was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. 12 chairs surrounded a sleek obsidian table, polished to the point of reflection. Men and women in suits that cost more than most annual salaries sat straight-backed, eyes sharp, waiting to see whether the once unshakable Graham Whitmore would crack or retaliate. Graham stood at the head of the table. He looked calm, but the calm wasn't the kind that came from control. It came from a quiet knowing, the kind a man has when he's walked through fire and stopped pretending he can avoid the burn. He didn't bring a team. He didn't bring charts. He brought Lily Carter. She entered the room 5 minutes after the meeting started. No fanfare, just a woman in a charcoal gray suit, a leather folio in hand, and a gaze that had already taken the measure of everyone before a word was spoken. Most of the board members hadn't seen her in years, some never, but they knew who she was, and that was enough to change the temperature of the room. Graham spoke first. There's been a motion to transition executive leadership, he said. You've all read the memo, I'm sure. A few murmurs, a few nods. What's missing from that memo, he continued, is context, and what's missing from this room until now is integrity. He turned slightly, gesturing to Lily. This is Lily Carter, founder of ArcLight, and the former architect of the first equitable energy distribution proposal this company ever rejected. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted in their chair. She's here because she knows what we've forgotten, Graham said. That energy isn't about politics or profit. It's about people, about power, in the truest sense, the power to change, to heal, to restore. Lily stepped forward then, laying her folio on the table and opening it with quiet precision. Inside were reports, documents, proof of mismanagement, misuse of internal funds by Philip Grant, back-channel communications between him and Natalie Evans, leaked memos to Meridian executives, evidence of a planned merger that would have stripped Whitmore Energy of its independence and innovation. It was surgical. It was fire. Delivered without rage, only fact. Your COO, Lily said, her voice clear and composed, has been preparing to gut your mission in the name of optics and market control. He wasn't building toward a future. He was buying time. She looked up, holding the gaze of each board member, one by one. I'm not here to resurrect Graham's reputation, she continued. I'm here to remind you that leadership is about presence, not position. He's made mistakes, but he's also the only one in this room who remembered that this company was founded not to compete with giants, but to disrupt them. The room fell silent. Graham didn't speak. He didn't have to. Lily's words weren't a favor. They were a reckoning. Later, in the silence of the executive elevator, Graham leaned against the glass as the floors descended. Lily stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the city come closer. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. Why did you? She glanced at him. Because for the first time in a long time, you weren't protecting your power. You were protecting your purpose. They reached the lobby, and neither moved. He turned to her. You were brilliant in there. She smirked faintly. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not, he said. I'm grateful. She shrugged on her coat, preparing to leave. You don't owe me anything, he added. I know, she replied. But still, he said, I owe you everything. She paused, looking up at him, and for a flicker of a moment, the weight between them years of silence, love, anger, memory softened, not disappeared, but softened. They stepped out into the chilled city air, a quiet wind brushing against brick and bone. Are you going back to Vermont? He asked. For a while, she said. I've got a few local projects that need attention. He nodded. You could use some fresh air, too, she said, almost teasing. Get your boots muddy again. He smiled, really smiled for the first time in days. You know, he said, you're still the only person who ever told me when I was full of it. She raised an eyebrow. You say that, like it's a compliment. It is. They stood at the corner of 47th and Park, traffic rumbling by, the city unaware that something quietly profound had just happened. Two people who once built a life together had stood in the ashes of its collapse and chosen to acknowledge the fire, not run from it. Lily stepped off the curb to hail a cab. One pulled up almost instantly. Before she got in, she turned one last time. You know how to reach me, she said. I do. And then, just before the door closed, she added, don't waste what you remembered today. The cab pulled away, and Graham stood there, coat open to the wind, heart open in a way it hadn't been for years. That night, back in his penthouse apartment, he sat at his kitchen counter not with scotch, not with spreadsheets, but with a yellow legal pad and a pen. And he began to write, not a press release, not a pitch, but a letter to himself, a promise, not to reclaim what was lost, but to become what was missing. The next morning, Graham Whitmore rose before the sun, not out of habit, out of need. For the first time in months, maybe years, he craved silence not as a shield, but as a space to listen. He stepped barefoot into the kitchen of his penthouse. The marble felt cold beneath his feet. No assistant was scheduled to arrive. No meetings loomed on his calendar. The city outside was still asleep, cloaked in soft gray before the storm of day. He brewed coffee himself, dark roast, black, no sugar, and then, without a word, he picked up the yellow legal pad he'd started the night before and kept writing, not about quarterly targets, not about damage control, but about how far he'd drifted from the man who once stayed up late sketching solar panel prototypes on napkins with Lily, laughing when the numbers didn't add up. That man had believed in impact before scale, in purpose before prestige. Graham had once been full of that kind of hope, and he wanted it back. By noon, he had made 3 phone calls, one to the board, requesting a full audit, not just financial but cultural. He wanted to know where values had been lost and how to rebuild them. One to Russell Dane, not with hostility, but curiosity. What did Meridian learn from Lily that Whitmore Energy hadn't? And the third call to a small-town mayor in Alabama, whose district still experienced blackouts weekly. I want to listen, Graham said. The mayor, hesitant at first, finally said, You know, Mr. Whitmore, people usually call us after something breaks. Graham replied, Something already did. Later that week, he boarded a flight to Vermont. No entourage, no press. Just him and a carry-on bag. He hadn't been back since Lily left. The cabin still existed, he'd never sold it, but it had remained locked and untouched, like a room in a museum no one dared to enter. The drive from the airport was quiet, winding through pine forests and snow-laced fields. When he arrived, the air was still cold, the kind of cold that slowed your breath, forced presence into every movement. He unlocked the front door. Everything was as they left it. The fireplace was empty, but the blanket she used to wrap around her shoulders still hung on the back of the old armchair. Dust clung to the edges of the bookshelves. In the kitchen, a cracked mug with faded lettering read, "Power comes from within." He chuckled. She'd given it to him after their first investor pitch. He lit a fire, then sat in silence as the cabin warmed. That evening, as the flames danced, Graham opened a worn leather journal he'd found in one of the drawers. It was Lily's pages, filled with notes, diagrams, questions, quotes in her looping handwriting. One entry stood out. If you lose your way, build something small with love, even if no one sees it, even if it doesn't scale. Love, after all, is the only blueprint that survives every storm. Graham closed the journal and exhaled. In that moment, he didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a man. A knock at the door came the next morning, soft, unexpected. He opened it to find Lily. She wore a thick coat, snow in her hair, cheeks flushed from the walk. "I heard from the mayor," she said. "Told me someone unusual called him. said he was coming back to his roots. Graham smiled. You always did have good sources. She stepped inside. There was a long silence. Not awkward, just full. Then she looked around. Still smells like cedar and stubbornness. He laughed. You're not wrong. She set her gloves down on the counter, taking in the space. This place holds a lot, she said. It does. He offered her coffee. They sat, the cabin filled with the comforting sound of clinking cups and creaking floorboards. The fire crackled between them, warming the places where old wounds used to live. I'm not here to ask you to come back, Graham said after a while. I know, she replied. I'm not even here to fix anything. Also good, she added. He looked down at his hands. I wanted to find out if the man you believed in still existed. She was quiet. Then he does. Graham looked up. But not because you found this place, she added, because you stopped trying to perform and started trying to listen. He nodded. They sat in that truth. And then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder. What's that? He asked. Something I never showed you. She laid it on the table. Inside were hand-drawn plans, early designs for off-grid microsolar systems tailored to rural communities. The same model she'd taken to Meridian. But these were older. These were yours, he asked. She smiled. Ours. From that night, we stayed up arguing about battery storage until 3 a.m. He laughed. I was so sure I was right. You weren't, she teased. No, but I remember thinking, if I'm wrong, at least I'm wrong next to you. They sat together, shoulders almost touching. The past wasn't gone, but it wasn't a trap anymore. It was a map. And maybe it led somewhere new. The Vermont cabin didn't ask for anything. It didn't demand ambition, attention, or answers. It simply was steady, aged, and full of echoes. A place where time softened, not because it slowed, but because it stopped competing. Graham Whitmore rose early again, but this time, not from restlessness, from rhythm. He chopped firewood outside, his breath fogging in the crisp mountain air. He used to find this kind of labor unnecessary, something to outsource. But this morning, with each swing of the axe, he felt grounded, human, present. There was no phone buzzing with numbers, no assistant bringing curated reports, just the weight of wood, the cold against his face, and the quiet satisfaction of doing something useful with his hands. Inside. Lily had made coffee. She didn't ask questions when he came in, just handed him a mug like she used to, then went back to the crossword spread out on the kitchen table. Their silence wasn't distance. It was comfort, shared. By midday, they had driven into town. The main street of Maple Hollow hadn't changed much. The bakery still smelled like cinnamon and rain. The hardware store still had a handwritten cash-only sign taped to the window. And the library. Graham smiled, still had Lily's donated bench out front, carved with the words, "Ideas are seeds that grow in silence." They visited the local energy co-op, a small building with thin walls and big dreams. Inside, they met with the mayor. Graham had called, along with a few community leaders and curious residents. This wasn't a presentation, it was a conversation. Graham listened more than he spoke. He asked questions not to challenge, but to understand. When one older farmer named Jack leaned in and said, "I don't trust big city billionaires." No offense. Graham simply nodded. None taken. He said, most of them wouldn't trust themselves, either. That broke the tension. By the time they left, someone had already offered them pie. That meant something here. That night, back at the cabin. Graham sat by the fire, flipping through the folder Lily had brought. The sketches, the notes, the early microgrid ideas they'd once dreamed up together, it all still held potential. Not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. Because it was real. "Do you remember," Lily said softly, sitting across from him, "how you once said you'd rather build something that mattered to 50 people than something flashy that served none?" He smiled. I forgot I ever said that. I didn't. She sipped her tea, then added, the world doesn't need more billionaires, Graham. It needs more people who remember why they started. Graham nodded. I've been thinking. He said, maybe the way forward isn't scaling up. Maybe it's scaling deep, going local, partnering with towns instead of lobbying senators. Lily's eyes lit up. Start with one town, she said. Do it right. Let the story tell itself. Graham leaned back. It'd need a name. She raised a brow. You're asking the woman who named a nonprofit ArcLight. He laughed. Good point. He was quiet for a moment, then said, what about wildfire? Lily paused, as in destructive, as in catalytic. Something that clears the dead brush, makes way for something new. She smiled slowly. When ashes bloom, they looked at each other, and something between them, long buried under years of silence and pain, stirred again, not as romance, but as resonance. In the days that followed, Graham didn't just stay in Vermont, he dug in. He drafted a plan with Lily's help, localized solar hubs, with community ownership, revenue-sharing models, reinvestment into infrastructure, not charity, not extraction, partnership. They met with engineers, teachers, farmers. They walked through abandoned buildings, imagining what they could become. Lily, as always, saw not what was, but what could be. And Graham surprisingly followed her lead, not because he had nothing left to offer, but because, for once, he didn't need to lead to feel worthy. He just needed to serve. One afternoon, they stood in the old mill outside town, a structure of timber and dust and story. I always thought I had to prove something, Graham said, running his fingers along the weathered beams. To my father, to the world, to myself. And now I just want to build something that survives me. Lily walked over, resting a hand on one of the beams. You already are, she said. Not with praise, with truth. On their final night before she returned to New York, they sat under the stars, no words, just the sound of pine trees whispering in the dark. When Lily finally stood, she looked down at him. I'm glad you found your way here, she said. I wouldn't have without you. She shook her head. No, you found the road. I just reminded you it existed. She kissed his forehead, not an invitation, a blessing, and left. Graham sat for a long time after she was gone. The sky stretched wide above him. He thought about power, not the kind that lights up cities, but the kind that sparks inside a heart long forgotten. He thought about what love really was, not possession, but presence, not permanence, but impact. And in the quiet, he whispered to no one, let it burn, let it clear, let it bloom. When the papers were finally signed, there were no cameras, no speeches, no champagne. Just a quiet handshake in the back office of a former general store, now repurposed as the planning hub for wildfire, a name that had started as a metaphor and now lived on a hand-painted wooden sign above the front door. Graham Whitmore stood beside the town mayor and Jack, the skeptical farmer turned unlikely advisor. The air smelled like old paper and wood smoke. The room had a coffee pot older than most of Graham's staff back in Manhattan. And somehow, it felt more meaningful than any boardroom he'd ever stepped into. This was where his legacy began, not in glass towers, but in this little room, in a town that had every reason not to believe him, yet chose to try anyway. 3 families have signed on to host the first panels, said Mayor Harris, gesturing toward a map on the wall dotted with sticky notes. It's not much, but it's a start. It's everything, Graham said. Jack grunted in agreement. Trust takes time. You show up every week, rain or shine. People will notice. Just don't come in here throwing TED Talks and business cards. Graham smiled. Understood. They had started calling him Graham now. Not Mr. Whitmore. Not the guy from New York. Just Graham. That, too, felt like legacy. In the weeks that followed, progress didn't look flashy. It looked like wiring installed by local hands, like 4th graders painting sun-shaped logos on community flyers, like Lily video calling in from New York to help troubleshoot system designs, her voice weaving easily into conversations as if she had never left. She didn't rejoin Whitmore Energy. She didn't need to. Her influence was baked into every blueprint, every town hall pitch Graham gave, every pause he took before answering a question to make sure he wasn't speaking at, but with. Graham had learned that legacy doesn't speak loudly. It listens. It kneels down in the mud. It hands over tools. It remembers names. It asks, "What do you need?" before it declares, "Here's what we'll do." One afternoon, while helping install solar panels on the rooftop of a modest home on the edge of town, Graham found himself side by side with a young boy named Caleb, maybe 11, wiry, curious, full of questions. "Is it true you used to be a billionaire?" Caleb asked, squinting against the sun. "I still am," Graham said, tightening a bolt. "Then why are you doing this?" the boy asked. "Don't you have people for this?" "I used to," Graham replied. "But they didn't always understand why it mattered." Caleb thought about that, then nodded. "I think it's cool you're here." It wasn't praise. It was permission. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Graham walked back toward the cabin. His boots were caked with dirt. His hands smelled like copper and pine. He hadn't checked his phone in hours. Inside, he found a package waiting. Lily had sent a book. Inside the cover, she had written, "Some seeds bloom in silence. Water well. Be patient. L." He ran his thumb over the handwriting, the way one might trace the edge of a memory. He didn't know what the future would look like, but for the first time in years, he wasn't trying to control it. He was trying to build it, with care, with people, with roots, not reach. That weekend, they held a small town gathering. No stage, no spotlights, just folding chairs in the local school gym, homemade casseroles, and a line of kids performing a song they wrote about the Sun House project. Graham stood in the back, near the bulletin board. Someone handed him a plate. Someone else patted his shoulder. He was no longer the outsider. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just there, present. That was enough. When the lights dimmed and the kids began to sing off-key, enthusiastic, messy, he felt something break open in his chest. Not pain, not regret, just a full, quiet joy. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that stays. That night, he sat again by the fire. No documents, no deals, just a notebook and the soft sound of wind outside. He wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Legacy is presence. Then, underneath, do good work, stay longer, ask better questions, forgive yourself, begin again. He didn't know who would read it someday. Maybe no one. But it didn't matter. Because legacy wasn't a statue or a speech. It was a story people told quietly, when no one was watching. He showed up. He stayed. He listened. He built something that mattered to us. The snow came early that week in Maple Hollow. It fell softly, as if the sky didn't want to disturb the rhythm the town had settled into. Kids dragged sleds behind them down slushy sidewalks. The general store played old folk songs on a dusty radio. Everything seemed paused in the gentle hush only winter could bring. Inside the cabin, Graham Whitmore stirred his coffee with the back of a spoon. The fire crackled steadily, the scent of pine wood wrapping around him like memory. He wore the same worn sweater he'd found in the back of the closet a month ago, the one Lily used to tease him about for looking like a professor on sabbatical. He didn't mind. This new life suited him, until the envelope arrived. It was hand-delivered by a courier, no logos, no fanfare, just a man in a parka who knocked once and handed it over like it was nothing more than a utility bill. Graham opened it slowly. The letter inside was crisp, impeccable. Heavy paper, embossed header, Meridian Global Ventures. At the bottom, a name he hadn't seen in months. Russell Dane. He read the offer once, then again, and then a third time, this time more slowly. The proposition was clear. A formal acquisition proposal for Wildfire, backed by federal infrastructure grants, co-branded with Whitmore Energy as honorary founding partner. Lily Carter's name featured prominently as strategic advisor, Rural Energy Impact Initiative, and the number 9 digits, enough to fund 10 more towns, enough to turn this entire experiment into a global pilot program, enough to make him question everything. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he bundled up, walked to the edge of town, and found himself on the ridge overlooking Maple Hollow. The valley stretched before him, soft and lit by the amber glow of windows and street lamps. Smoke curled from chimneys. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then fell silent. This was what he'd built, not alone, but with every conversation, every muddy step. Every child who now pointed at the sky and asked how power could come from sunlight instead of smoke. This town had changed him. Could he do it again? On a larger scale, would scaling mean compromising? Would partnering with Russell Dane mean risking everything he'd relearned about trust back at the cabin? He called Lily. "I got something today," he said. "I know," she replied softly. "You did too." Yes. They were quiet for a long moment. Then Graham asked, "What do you think? I think it's tempting." "It is. And I think," she added, "that the version of you from 6 months ago would have signed already. And now, I don't know," she said honestly. "That depends on whether you still believe in small beginnings or if you're ready to chase something big again." He leaned against the windowsill, watching the snow settle on the glass. "What if we could do both?" he asked. Lily paused. "Then we'd need to be very clear about one thing," she said. "Who's holding the pen?" The next morning, Graham drove to the nearest city, to a quiet cafe where Russell Dane waited, sipping espresso like he was posing for a Forbes cover. "Graham," Russell said, rising, "you look rustic. You look like someone who thinks he's already won." Russell chuckled. "Don't be dramatic. I came to offer a gift." Graham raised an eyebrow. "With your name etched into every inch of it. It's a partnership. It's an absorption." Russell leaned back. "You've built something beautiful. I'm just giving it a chance to survive. It already is surviving." "Barely," Russell countered. "What happens when winter hits harder, when other towns want the same but you can't scale fast enough? What happens when funding dries up and people start asking hard questions?" Graham stared at him for a moment, then said, "Then I answer them. I face them. I don't sell them out for stability." Russell's smile faded just slightly. "You're choosing pride over reach," he said. "No," Graham said. "I'm choosing roots over noise." He stood. "Thanks for the coffee. You'll regret this." Graham looked him in the eye. "No, I regretted who I became chasing your approval the first time. I'm not doing it again." Back in Maple Hollow, the wind had picked up. Snow swirled sideways, dancing against the old school's windows. Inside, Graham stood before a group of volunteers. Jack, the mayor, even Caleb's parents, all waiting to hear his decision. He looked around. These were no longer strangers. These were his people. He held up the letter, folded now in his hand. "This," he said, "was an offer to grow wildfire into something massive, global, immediate." He paused. "But it would have meant giving control to people who never sat with you, never asked what you wanted, never walked your streets or wired your barns." He looked out over the group. I said no. A beat of silence, then applause, not thunderous, but real, grounded. That night, Graham sat by the fire, flipping through old sketches. He didn't need a trademark. He didn't need a press release. He needed what he had: one town, one truth, one way forward. Lily texted later, "You did the right thing. You're still writing the blueprint." And he texted back, "This time, it'll be in pencil, so we can revise together." Spring came late to Maple Hollow that year. The snow lingered like a guest reluctant to leave. But under the frost, change was stirring. Crocuses poked through the soil along the church steps. The breeze softened, and children began leaving their coats at home again, evidence that the sun was winning. At the edge of town, in what used to be an abandoned sawmill, light now spilled through new solar-paneled skylights. Inside, the walls bore hand-painted murals, sunrises, rivers, children's names in bold crayon strokes. The space, once filled with rust and shadows, now thrummed with life. This was the Wildfire Center, part school, part community hub, part microgrid operations base, and all heart. Graham Whitmore stood at the front window, watching as volunteers from 3 counties helped assemble equipment for the next expansion site. One boy, Caleb, wore a vest with the Wildfire logo stitched on the back. He gave Graham a quick thumbs up before disappearing into a sea of boxes. Graham smiled. It had been 6 months since he'd said no to Meridian's offer. 6 months since he'd bet on people over power. And while there were still bills, setbacks, and nights full of doubt, there was also this real progress, real change. He didn't own this place. He belonged to it. "Need a second opinion," came a familiar voice from behind. He turned to see Lily Carter, stepping into the room with a warm coffee in hand, wearing that same quiet confidence she always carried, like she trusted the world might still surprise her, even after everything. "I thought you weren't coming until tomorrow," he said. "Changed my mind," she replied. Felt like something worth showing up for. She handed him the coffee. He took it, their hands brushing just slightly. She looked around. "It's beautiful." "You were right," he said, "about what that building something small with love could start a revolution." She gave him a look. "Don't get poetic, I have evidence." He chuckled. Later that day, they walked down the main street together. Shops were open. Dogs barked at squirrels. A kid rode by on a bike with no hands, grinning. "Remember the first time we drove through here?" Lily asked. "I remember thinking the town looked forgotten. And now, I think it looks like it forgave us." She smiled softly. They passed the general store, where Jack stood under the awning, nodding at them like a farmer proud of his crops. They passed the library, where someone had chalked wildfire sparks here on the sidewalk. They passed the school, where children now learned about renewable energy in science class not as theory, but as their daily reality. Legacy wasn't a monument. It was a town that glowed after dark. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in molten gold, the town gathered in the gymnasium for a small ceremony. No spotlights, just stories. One by one, people stood up to speak. A mother who no longer worried about winter outages. A teacher whose students had built their own wind-powered radio. A high school senior, first in her family to apply to college, writing her entrance essay about the billionaire who brought light, not with dollars, but with dignity. Graham sat in the back row, Lily beside him. Neither needed to speak. The room did it for them. As the evening wound down, Lily walked to the front with a small wooden box. Inside it, one of the original solar connectors. A photo of the first panel install. A folded piece of paper that simply read, "Begin again." "You," she handed it to Caleb. He blinked in surprise. "This is your story now," Lily said. "Take care of it." The boy nodded, eyes wide. Graham smiled. "Don't drop it. It's worth more than stock options." Laughter rippled through the room. Later, back at the cabin, the fire crackled and pine filled the air again. Graham and Lily sat across from one another, old teacups in hand, older memories in the air. "So, what now?" she asked. He looked around. "Now we stay, build slower, love steadier, and leave light wherever we go." She nodded. "And maybe write it down." He lifted an eyebrow. "You want me to write a book? I want you to tell the truth," she said. "Not just yours. Ours. The kind that helps people remember there's still something worth building." He leaned back, eyes soft. "Do I get a co-author?" She smiled. "You never stopped having one." That night, as snow melted into streams and the wind carried spring through the trees, Graham sat down at his desk and wrote the opening line. This isn't a story about falling. It's a story about choosing to rise quietly, humbly, again and again. Because somewhere, someone still believes in the light, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not titles, not money, not headlines. Just this, the light they'd left behind, and the fire it had started in others. Sometimes, losing everything you thought mattered is the only way to find what truly does. Graham's journey reminds us that success built on silence and disconnection can never fill the quiet within. In chasing power, he lost his marriage, his purpose, and nearly himself. But in a small town, among ordinary people, he remembered something essential: our worth is not measured by what we own, but by how we show up for others. As we grow older, it's easy to believe our greatest chapters are behind us. But perhaps the most meaningful moments come not from achievements, but from healing, listening, and starting again with gentler hands and a wiser heart. Whether we are rebuilding relationships, reconnecting with old dreams, or simply slowing down to feel life again. This story gently reminds us it's never too late to begin again. And the light we leave behind may be the most lasting legacy of all. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us. If this story touched something in your heart, even just a little, we hope you'll carry that feeling into your own life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every click helps us bring more healing, heartfelt stories to people who need them. Until next time, stay kind and stay connected.